15th January 1943, Stalingrad Pocket, Soviet Union. Gefreiter Hans Detmer crouched in what had once been a basement bakery, his skeletal hands clutching a rifle he no longer had ammunition to fire. The temperature outside had plunged to -35 degrees Celsius, and the wind howled through the shattered walls like the screams of dying men. His breath came in short, ragged gasps that crystallized instantly in the frozen air. Around him, what remained of his company, 11 men out of the original 180, huddled together for warmth that no longer existed. Their uniforms were little more than rags stuffed with newspaper and straw. Their boots, long since fallen apart, had been replaced with crude wrappings torn from Soviet corpses. Detmer's stomach, empty for 3 days except for a handful of frozen horse bones boiled into a gray soup, cramped with a pain that had become constant. Outside, Soviet artillery thundered endlessly, methodically crushing what remained of the German Sixth Army. But it wasn't the shells that terrified him most. It was the cold, the bone-deep, soul-crushing cold that turned men into ice sculptures mid-stride, that made fingers snap off like brittle twigs, that invaded dreams and memories until nothing else existed. Detmer had survived France and the early months of Barbarossa. He had believed himself invincible. Now, in this frozen hell that was Stalingrad, he understood the truth. He was already dead. He just hadn't stopped breathing yet. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War. Stories of courage, sacrifice, and battles that pushed human endurance beyond all limits. Where are you watching from today? And could you have endured what these soldiers faced in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, a nightmare that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives? To understand how Stalingrad became the frozen nightmare that German soldiers never forgot, we must trace the path that led the Wehrmacht's finest into this catastrophic trap. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, had erupted across the Soviet border on 22 June 1941 with overwhelming force. 3 million German troops, 3,600 tanks, and 2,700 aircraft constituted the largest military invasion in human history. The early victories were spectacular. Entire Soviet armies encircled and destroyed, hundreds of thousands of prisoners taken, vast territories conquered in weeks that had taken Napoleon months to traverse. But Moscow didn't fall. The Soviet capital, besieged through the autumn of 1941, held firm. Then came the Russian winter of 1941-42, a season so brutal it transformed German soldiers into frozen casualties by the thousands. For the first time since the war began, the Wehrmacht retreated. The myth of invincibility cracked. German commanders learned a terrible lesson about Russian winters, but Hitler, in his arrogance, believed he could avoid repeating that mistake. For 1942, Hitler redirected his strategy southward. Operation Blue would capture the oil fields of the Caucasus, the petroleum that fueled Stalin's war machine. Without oil, Soviet tanks would become immobile monuments, and aircraft would never leave the ground. But to secure the Caucasus, Hitler needed to control the flanks along the Don and Volga rivers, and sitting squarely on the Volga was an industrial city of 400,000 people, a city bearing the name of Hitler's greatest ideological enemy, Stalingrad. The mission fell to General Friedrich Paulus and his Sixth Army, over 270,000 battle-hardened troops who had conquered France and driven deep into Soviet territory. They were equipped with 500 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and backed by the Luftwaffe's devastating air power. These men believed they were the finest soldiers in the world. They had no idea they were marching toward a frozen nightmare that would haunt every survivor for the rest of their lives. On 23 August 1942, the Luftwaffe conducted a devastating air raid on Stalingrad, killing over 40,000 civilians and reducing much of the city to burning rubble. German soldiers watching from the steppe believed the battle was already won. They couldn't have been more catastrophically wrong. The ruins would become the perfect defensive terrain for Soviet forces, and the approaching winter would transform Stalingrad into a frozen hell that made the previous winter look merciful by comparison. The German assault on Stalingrad began in September with confidence bordering on arrogance. General Vasily Chukhov's Soviet 62nd Army defended the city with a revolutionary tactic. His troops would hug the Germans, staying so close to enemy lines, sometimes just 20 or 30 meters, that the Luftwaffe couldn't bomb without hitting German soldiers. Every building became a fortress, every street a killing ground. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats, and it consumed both armies in savage urban combat, unlike anything the modern world had seen. For weeks, German forces ground forward through the ruins, capturing the city block by bloody block. They took Mamayev Kurgan, the strategic hill overlooking the city, after days of fighting so intense that the slope changed hands multiple times within single days. They fought for the railway station, capturing and losing it 15 times in 6 days. They battled for the factory district, the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, the Barricadi gun factory, and the Red October steel plant, where workers assembled tanks in the morning and drove them straight into combat in the afternoon. By early November, the Germans controlled 90% of Stalingrad. Victory seemed days away, but the city refused to die. And while German forces exhausted themselves in the ruins, winter was coming. Not the winter they'd experienced before, but something far worse. A cold so intense it would make the previous year's temperatures seem mild. One German soldier, Lieutenant Wilhelm Hoffmann, kept a diary. On 26 November, he wrote, "It's getting colder. The wind cuts through our uniforms like knives. The men are talking about winter clothing that was supposed to arrive weeks ago. It never came. We were told we'd be home before winter. Now winter is here and we're still in this cursed city." Then, on 19th November 1942, everything changed. The Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive that struck the weak Romanian and Hungarian armies guarding the German flanks. Within 4 days, Soviet pincers met at Kalach-on-the-Don, 50 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The trap closed. The entire 6th Army, over 290,000 men, was encircled, cut off from supply, surrounded by Soviet forces, and winter was descending.
Friedrich Paulus requested permission to break out immediately while the Soviet ring was still weak. Hitler refused. Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering promised the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped army by air, 500 tons daily. It was a catastrophic lie. The airlift would deliver barely 1/5 of that amount on good days, and nothing during blizzards. Hitler ordered the 6th Army to hold Stalingrad and await relief. Paulus, ever the obedient officer, obeyed. The window of escape closed, and 290,000 men were condemned to experience a frozen nightmare beyond imagination. The nightmare began gradually, then accelerated into horror. November's cold was merely uncomfortable, temperatures hovering around -10 degrees Celsius. German soldiers, still in summer uniforms with only thin greatcoats, shivered but endured. They believed the situation was temporary, that relief would come, that the airlift would sustain them. These beliefs lasted approximately 2 weeks. By early December, temperatures had plunged to -20 degrees. The Volga River began to freeze solid. The steppe around Stalingrad became a white wasteland scoured by winds that felt like razors cutting exposed skin. German soldiers lacked winter clothing. The winter uniforms sat in warehouses in Germany because Hitler had insisted the war would be over before winter. Now, trapped in the pocket, men improvised desperately. They stuffed newspaper under their uniforms. They wrapped rags around their hands and feet. They took clothing from Soviet corpses, thick felt boots, padded jackets, fur hats, risking execution if caught wearing enemy uniforms, but risking death from cold if they didn't. The airlift was failing catastrophically. Luftwaffe transport planes, Junkers Ju-52s and Henkel He-111s, struggled to reach the pocket through blizzards and Soviet anti-aircraft fire. On good days, perhaps 100 tons of supplies arrived. On bad days, nothing. The trapped army needed 500 tons daily just to survive. Food, ammunition, medical supplies, fuel. They were receiving 1/5 of that on average. Starvation began. Rations were cut to 300 grams of bread per day in early December, then 200 grams, then 100 grams, a single thin slice. Men who had marched into Stalingrad as healthy soldiers began to waste away. Their faces became gaunt, cheeks hollow, eyes sunken. Ribs showed through their skin. They moved slowly, conserving every calorie. The horses, thousands of them, used for transportation, were slaughtered systematically. Every part was used. Meat for food, hides for clothing, bones boiled for souk, hooves rendered for gelatin. By mid-December, the horses were gone. Soldiers ate anything they could find. Leather belts were boiled into a gelatinous paste and consumed. Boot soles were chewed for any trace of nutrition. Wallpaper was scraped from the few remaining buildings and eaten for the flour in the paste. Rats, which swarmed in the ruins feeding on corpses, became prized catches. There were whispered rumors, never confirmed, always denied, of cannibalism in the most desperate units. And the cold kept intensifying. By late December, temperatures hit -30 degrees Celsius. Exposed skin froze in seconds. Frostbite claimed thousands. Soldiers watched their fingers turn white, then gray, then black. Toes became numb, then painful, then dead. Field hospitals, overwhelmed and lacking supplies, performed amputations without anesthesia. The screams could be heard across entire sectors. One doctor wrote in his journal, "I have performed 67 amputations in the past week. We have no morphine, no ether, nothing for pain. They scream until they pass out. Most die from shock or infection within days. I am not saving them. I am merely documenting their deaths." January 1943 brought the full fury of Russian winter to the Stalingrad pocket. Temperatures plunged to -35 degrees, then -40. The wind created a wind chill that made the air feel like -50 or worse. It was cold beyond description, beyond experience, beyond endurance. Men died simply from standing guard duty for an hour. They would be found frozen solid in their positions, rifles still in hand, eyes open and staring at nothing. The frozen nightmare consumed everything. Water froze instantly. Canteens became solid blocks of ice. Weapons froze. The Carabiner 98K rifles that German soldiers carried would freeze solid overnight. Bolts wouldn't move. Trigger mechanisms locked. Machine guns became useless as lubricants froze and ammunition belts stiffened. Soldiers had to keep weapons inside their uniforms, next to their bodies, sacrificing precious warmth to maintain operational firearms. Vehicles died by the thousands. Tank engines seized as oil turned to sludge. Trucks wouldn't start. Artillery pieces froze in position. The German army, mechanized and mobile, became immobilized by cold. Even the most basic tasks became nightmarish ordeals. Digging defensive positions in ground frozen harder than concrete was impossible. Burying the dead was impossible. Corpses were simply stacked like cordwood to be buried later, if later ever came. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical suffering. German soldiers had been told they were supermen, that they were invincible, that victory was their destiny. Now they were reduced to starving, freezing wretches fighting for survival in a frozen wasteland. Letters home, those few that could be flown out on returning aircraft, revealed the mental anguish. One soldier wrote to his wife, "My darling Anna, I do not think you will ever read this letter. I do not think I will survive to see spring. The cold here is beyond anything you can imagine. Men are dying not from Russian bullets, but from the cold itself. We huddle together for warmth, but there is no warmth left. We are ghosts, waiting for death to finally claim us. Tell our children their father loved them. Tell them he died in a place where hell froze over." Another soldier's diary entry from 8th January 1943 read,
Fischer died last night. He simply went to sleep and never woke up. His body was frozen solid by morning. We couldn't bury him. The ground is like iron. We stacked him with the others. There are hundreds of frozen bodies stacked around the perimeter now. They will be here until spring, if spring ever comes. I envy Fischer. His suffering is over.
Soviet forces, better equipped for winter warfare with padded jackets, felt boots, and winter rations, tightened the noose. On 10th January, they launched Operation Ring, the systematic destruction of the German pocket. Over 7,000 Soviet artillery pieces bombarded German positions. Then came infantry and tanks, advancing methodically, overrunning defensive positions held by men too weak to resist effectively. The final weeks of January 1943 witnessed the complete disintegration of what had once been the German Sixth Army. The pocket was split in two on 24th January, separating northern and southern groups. Communication broke down, command structure collapsed, units ceased to exist as organized formations. Men fought in small groups, huddled in basements and ruins, waiting for the end. The cold became the primary killer. More German soldiers died from cold-related causes, hypothermia, frostbite complications, frozen lungs from breathing the super-cold air, than from Soviet bullets. One survivor later recalled, "The cold was an enemy more relentless than the Russians. You could hide from bullets, you could dodge shells, but you couldn't escape the cold. It was everywhere, always, consuming you from the outside in and the inside out. It invaded your dreams. When you closed your eyes, you saw ice. When you opened them, you saw frozen corpses. The cold became all that existed." Disease ravaged what starvation and cold hadn't claimed. Typhus, spread by lice that infested every soldier, killed thousands. Dysentery from contaminated water and spoiled food killed thousands more. Pneumonia and tuberculosis, thriving in the weakened, malnourished bodies of soldiers living in freezing conditions, swept through the pocket like wildfire. Field hospitals became morgues. Doctors and medics, themselves dying from starvation and disease, could do nothing but watch their patients die. The psychological horror of the frozen nightmare manifested in ways that haunted survivors forever. Men developed what doctors would later recognize as severe PTSD, though the term didn't exist then. They experienced hallucinations brought on by starvation, hypothermia, and exhaustion. Some saw their families calling to them from the snow. Others heard voices of dead comrades. Some simply stopped speaking, stopped eating, stopped caring, and died with their eyes open, staring at nothing. On 30th January, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal in a cynical gesture meant to pressure him into fighting to the death or committing suicide, since no German field marshal had ever surrendered. But Paulus, watching his army die around him, chose life over Hitler's twisted sense of honor. On 31st January, Soviet troops stormed his command bunker. He surrendered the southern pocket. 2 days later, on 2nd February, the northern pocket capitulated. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. Of the 290,000 German and Axis soldiers encircled in November 1942, approximately 91,000 survived to surrender. Nearly 200,000 died in the pocket, the majority from starvation, cold, and disease rather than combat. But even for the survivors, the nightmare wasn't over. Of those 91,000 prisoners, only about 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The rest died in Soviet POW camps over the following years, still dying from the effects of the frozen nightmare they'd endured. The survivors of Stalingrad carried the frozen nightmare with them for the rest of their lives. Those who made it home, released from Soviet captivity in the 1950s, were forever changed.
Many never spoke of their experiences, unable to find words adequate to describe what they'd endured. Others suffered from what we now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares that never stopped, hypervigilance that never relaxed, psychological wounds that never healed. One survivor, interviewed decades later, said, "I returned home in 1955, 13 years after I was captured, but part of me never left Stalingrad. Every winter, when the temperature drops, I'm back there. I feel the cold in my bones, not just a memory, but the actual sensation of freezing to death. I see my comrades dying around me. I smell the stench of frozen corpses and disease. I taste the horse-bone soup that kept us alive for a few more days." Stalingrad was not just a battle, it was a descent into a frozen hell that changed everyone who experienced it. We survived, but we never escaped. Another survivor wrote in his memoirs, "People ask what Stalingrad was like. I tell them it was cold. They think they understand. Everyone knows what being cold feels like, but they don't understand. The cold at Stalingrad was different. It was alive. It had intent. It wanted to kill you. And it was patient. It would start with your extremities, fingers and toes turning numb, then white, then gray, then black and dead. Then it would move inward, claiming more of you each day, your ears, your nose, your cheeks. You'd watch parts of yourself die while you were still alive. And all the while, you were starving and sick and surrounded by enemies who wanted to kill you. But the cold was worse than the Russians. The cold was the worst enemy I ever faced." The frozen nightmare of Stalingrad had strategic consequences that changed the course of World War II. Germany lost an entire field army, 24 generals, 2,500 officers, and nearly 300,000 troops. The Wehrmacht's aura of invincibility was shattered. German morale, both military and civilian, cracked. The myth that German willpower and tactical superiority could overcome any obstacle died in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad was validation, proof that the Red Army could not only stop the Wehrmacht, but could destroy it utterly. Soviet morale soared. Stalin's prestige increased. The victory demonstrated that the tide had turned. From Stalingrad onward, Germany would be on the defensive, retreating slowly but inevitably toward defeat. But beyond strategy and statistics, Stalingrad left a human legacy measured in trauma and memory. The frozen nightmare that German soldiers experienced became a cautionary tale about hubris, about the limits of human endurance, about what happens when ideology and ambition override reality and basic humanity. The cold of Stalingrad became legendary. Veterans of other battles, men who had fought in North Africa's heat, in Italy's mountains, in France's hedgerows, all acknowledged that Stalingrad's winter was uniquely horrific. British and American soldiers who interrogated German POWs after the war noted that men who had survived Stalingrad exhibited symptoms unlike any other veterans. They were jumpy around cold weather. They hoarded food compulsively. They couldn't sleep without multiple blankets, even in warm weather. The frozen nightmare had marked them permanently. Soviet soldiers who fought at Stalingrad also carried scars, though their experience was different. They had winter clothing, somewhat better rations, and were fighting on their own soil for their own survival. But they too experienced the nightmare of that winter, watching German soldiers freeze to death in their positions, seeing desperation drive men to acts of horror, witnessing the complete breakdown of human dignity that extreme cold and starvation can cause. One Soviet veteran recalled, "We hated the Germans for what they did to our country, for the invasion, for the atrocities, but by January 1943, when we saw what remained of their Sixth Army, it was hard to feel anything but pity. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were walking corpses, frozen scarecrows who could barely hold their weapons. When we overran their positions, we found men who had simply frozen to death at their posts. Others were so weak they couldn't surrender. They just sat and waited for us to either kill them or capture them, too exhausted to care which. The cold had defeated them more thoroughly than we ever could have." The frozen nightmare of Stalingrad entered German collective memory as perhaps the single most traumatic event of World War II on the Eastern Front. German families waited for news of fathers, sons, and brothers who had vanished into the Stalingrad pocket. Most never received confirmation of death, just a cold, bureaucratic notification that their loved one was missing in action somewhere near Stalingrad. The uncertainty was its own nightmare, lasting years or even decades until the few survivors returned from Soviet captivity in the 1950s, bringing stories of who had died and how. Today, when we think of Stalingrad, we think of it as a turning point, a strategic victory, a symbol of Soviet resilience. All of that is true. But for the German soldiers who experienced it, Stalingrad was something far more personal and far more terrible. It was the frozen nightmare that revealed the limits of human endurance, that showed what happens when men are pushed beyond all reasonable limits and kept there for months until death becomes preferable to continued suffering. The ruins of Stalingrad, rebuilt as Volgograd, no longer show the scars of that terrible winter, but the memories remain. Veterans who survived, now all deceased, the last having passed away in the early 21st century, carried those memories to their graves. They never forgot the cold. They never forgot the hunger. They never forgot watching their comrades die in ways that made a clean death in combat seem merciful. One survivor's final interview, recorded shortly before his death in 2003, summarized the experience. "I am 93 years old. I have lived a long life. I married, had children and grandchildren. I built a career, traveled, experienced many things. But when people ask what I remember most vividly, it's always the same: Stalingrad, the cold, the hunger, the despair. That winter marked me more deeply than anything else in my life. I survived it, but I never escaped it. In my dreams, I'm still there, still cold, still waiting for death in a frozen basement in a city that refused to die while we did." The frozen nightmare that German soldiers experienced at Stalingrad was the result of catastrophic leadership failures. Hitler's refusal to allow withdrawal when escape was possible, Göring's lie about aerial supply, the failure to provide winter clothing despite knowing winter was coming. These failures transformed a military defeat into a frozen horror that killed more men through starvation, cold, and disease than through combat. When Gefreiter Hans Detmer crouched in that frozen basement on 15th January, believing himself already dead, he was experiencing the culmination of months of compounding catastrophes. The cold that consumed him was real, but it was made far worse by the hunger that weakened his body's ability to generate warmth, by the lack of proper clothing that should have been provided, by the absence of adequate food and medical care that should have been airlifted in, by the strategic stupidity that trapped him there in the first place. Stalingrad's frozen nightmare teaches us that wars are not won solely through courage or tactics or even strategy. They are won or lost through logistics, through leadership, through the willingness to acknowledge reality and adapt to it. Hitler's refusal to face reality, his insistence that willpower could overcome supply shortages, that ideology could defeat winter, that a city's symbolic value justified the destruction of an entire army, created the conditions for the frozen nightmare. The soldiers who died in Stalingrad, whether quickly in combat or slowly from cold and starvation, were victims not just of Soviet resistance, but of their own leadership's incompetence and ideological blindness. They deserved better. They deserved leaders who would make decisions based on military reality rather than political symbolism. They deserved winter clothing, adequate food, and permission to withdraw when withdrawal could have saved their lives. Instead, they received orders to stand and die in a frozen nightmare that accomplished nothing except their own destruction. The city they died for was eventually abandoned anyway. The strategic objectives their deaths were supposed to secure were never achieved. They died for nothing except Hitler's pride and Göring's lies and Paulus's inability to disobey orders, even when those orders were insane. The frozen nightmare of Stalingrad remains one of World War II's most powerful cautionary tales, not just about the horrors of war, but about what happens when ambition overrides humanity, when ideology trumps reality, when leaders value symbols more than soldiers' lives. Every soldier who froze to death in a Stalingrad basement, every man who starved in that pocket, every amputee who screamed without anesthesia, all were casualties not primarily of Soviet military action, but of German leadership failure.
And the survivors, those few who made it home, carried that frozen nightmare with them forever. A reminder that some experiences are so traumatic, so far beyond normal human capacity to process, that they never fade, never heal, never truly end. Stalingrad was the frozen nightmare that German soldiers never forgot, because forgetting was impossible. The cold, the hunger, the despair, the watching of comrades die in ways that stripped away all dignity, these things became part of survivors' identities, permanent scars on their souls. When winter comes each year, when temperatures drop and winds howl and snow falls, there are no longer any Stalingrad survivors alive to feel that primal fear, to remember what real cold can do, to be transported back to that frozen hell. But their testimonies remain, recorded interviews, written memoirs, letters saved by families. These documents preserve the frozen nightmare, ensuring that we never forget what happened when an entire army was trapped in winter and left to die by leaders who valued pride over life. Stalingrad was many things: a turning point in World War II, a triumph of Soviet resistance, a demonstration of urban warfare's brutality. But for the German soldiers who experienced it, Stalingrad was above all else the frozen nightmare, a descent into conditions so extreme they seemed designed to test the absolute limits of what human beings can endure. Most failed that test, not through any fault of their own, but because the test itself was impossible, created by leaders who sacrificed their men for objectives that were never achievable. The cold of Stalingrad killed more German soldiers than Soviet bullets. The hunger of Stalingrad weakened men until disease claimed them. The despair of Stalingrad broke spirits that had remained strong through years of war. And all of it, every frozen corpse, every amputated limb, every man who went mad from hunger and cold, was preventable. Different decisions at critical moments could have spared the Sixth Army. But those decisions were never made, and 290,000 men paid the price. The frozen nightmare of Stalingrad stands as one of history's clearest examples of how leadership failures create human suffering on a massive scale. And every survivor carried that lesson with them, etched into their memories by frost and hunger and the deaths of comrades who deserved better than to freeze to death in a city that became their tomb. But while Stalingrad consumed the Wehrmacht's finest on the Eastern Front, American forces were locked in their own desperate struggle on a jungle island in the Pacific, where heat replaced cold as the killer and a malaria replaced frostbite, but the test of endurance was equally severe. Join us next time as we uncover the 6-month ordeal of Guadalcanal, where Marines fought not just the Japanese, but hunger, disease, and doubt in a campaign that would prove America's determination to win at any cost. Subscribe now and never miss the untold stories from the war that changed our world forever.